In the autumn of 1941, the German Wehrmacht appeared to be an unstoppable force of nature, a mechanized juggernaut that had shattered borders and pulverized armies from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Yet, as the frost began to bite into the Russian steppe, a different kind of challenge emerged in the far south. The Crimean Peninsula, a diamond-shaped protrusion into the Black Sea, stood as a strategic dagger pointed at the flank of the German advance. To Adolf Hitler, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier that threatened the vital oil fields of Romania. To the Soviet Union, it was the last bastion of naval power in the south, anchored by the legendary fortress city of Sevastopol. The story of the Siege of Sevastopol is not merely a chronicle of military maneuvers, it is a descent into the dark heart of industrial warfare. It represents the moment where the fluid, lightning-fast tactics of the Blitzkrieg collided with the immovable object of 19th-century fortification philosophy, updated with 20th-century steel. This was a battle for a landscape of limestone and salt, where the geography itself seemed to conspire against the invaders, and where the cost of victory would eventually bankrupt the moral and physical reserves of those who sought it. Erich von Manstein, perhaps the most gifted operational mind in the German High Command, was given the task of capturing the Crimea. He arrived to find his 11th Army facing a logistical nightmare. The only way into the peninsula was through the Perekop Isthmus, a narrow strip of land barely 5 miles wide. It was a bottleneck designed by nature to be a killing field. The Soviets had spent decades reinforcing this neck of land with a series of deep trenches and heavy artillery emplacements known as the Tartar Ditch. The initial German assault on Perekop in late September was a brutal introduction to the tenacity of the Soviet defender. Despite their air superiority, the Germans found themselves in a grueling war of attrition before they even set foot on the main body of the peninsula. Manstein, realizing that a frontal assault would bleed his infantry dry, utilized his superior tactical flexibility to bypass the heaviest concentrations of fire. By late October, the German 11th Army had broken through the isthmus and was fanning out across the Crimean plains. The path to Sevastopol seemed open, and the German High Command expected the city to fall within weeks. However, the German intelligence apparatus had fundamentally failed to grasp the sheer scale of Sevastopol's defenses. The city was not just protected by walls, it was encased in a multi-layered system of modern fortifications that utilized the rugged terrain of the Crimean mountains. To the north lay the Belbek Valley, guarded by a string of forts with names like Stalin, Molotov, and Siberia. To the east, the Sappan Heights offered a panoramic view of any approaching force, turning the valleys below into a giant shooting gallery for Soviet gunners. The most formidable obstacles were the coastal batteries, specifically Battery 30 and Battery 35, known to the Germans as Maxim Gorky 1 and 2. These were not mere bunkers. They were massive subterranean complexes topped with twin 12-inch naval gun turrets, capable of firing shells weighing nearly half a ton at targets 20 miles away. The crews lived deep underground in air-conditioned chambers, protected by meters of reinforced concrete and armor plate. As the vanguard of the 11th Army approached the outer perimeter in November 1941, they were greeted by the thunder of these giants, a sound that signaled the end of the war of movement and the beginning of a nightmare. The first systemic failure of the campaign was the German reliance on the momentum of the initial breakthrough. Manstein attempted a quick coup de main in late 1941, hoping to seize the city before the winter set in and the Soviets could solidify their lines. But the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, despite being harried by the Luftwaffe, performed a miracle of logistics. They ferried thousands of fresh troops from the Caucasus directly into the heart of the besieged city. The arrival of the 79th Naval Infantry Brigade, composed of sailors who fought with a legendary ferocity, checked the German advance in the suburban forests. These sailors, wearing their striped Telniashka shirts under their army tunics, became known as the Black Death. They fought with a suicidal bravery that unnerved the German Lanzer. In the close-quarters combat of the ravines and limestone caves, the technological advantages of the Wehrmacht were nullified. It was a war of grenades, bayonets, and sharpened shovels. By the time the first snows fell in December, the German offensive had ground to a halt. Manstein's men were exhausted, frostbitten, and staring at a fortress that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. The situation grew even more dire for the Germans when the Soviets launched a massive counter-amphibious operation on the Kerch Peninsula in late December 1941. This maneuver forced Manstein to divert precious divisions away from Sevastopol to deal with a new front in his rear. For several months, the Siege of Sevastopol became a secondary concern as the 11th Army fought for its very survival on the Kerch Isthmus. This period of relative calm for the city was used by the Soviet commander, General Ivan Petrov, to turn Sevastopol into an even more impenetrable labyrinth. Petrov was a master of defensive warfare. He organized the city into 4 sectors, each with its own reserves and fire support. He utilized the city's vast network of wine cellars and limestone quarries to house factories, hospitals, and even schools. While the surface of the city was slowly being reduced to rubble, a secret, subterranean Sevastopol thrived beneath the earth. This was a systemic resilience that the German High Command had never encountered in the West. It was a total mobilization of both the military and the civilian population, fused together by the desperation of survival. As the spring of 1942 arrived, Hitler became obsessed with the elimination of Sevastopol. He viewed it as a personal affront to German military prestige. To break the deadlock, he authorized the deployment of the largest concentration of heavy artillery in the history of warfare. This was the prelude to Operation Storfang, the final assault. The Germans brought in the Schwerer Gustav, an 800mm railway gun that was so large it required its own double-track railway and a crew of thousands. Beside it were the Karlgerät 600mm self-propelled mortars, designed specifically to crack the concrete of modern fortresses. The bombardment that preceded the June offensive was unlike anything seen before or since. For 5 days, the city was subjected to a continuous rain of steel. The sky was permanently blackened by smoke, and the ground shook with the rhythmic pounding of the heavy siege guns. The Schwerer Gustav fired its massive 7-ton shells at the ammunition magazines buried deep in the cliffs of Severnaya Bay, penetrating 30 meters of earth and rock before detonating. The German goal was not just to destroy the fortifications, but to shatter the psyche of the defenders. Yet, when the German infantry finally moved forward on June 7, 1942, they found that the Soviets were still there. Emerging from the dust and the ruins, the defenders met the German stormtroopers with blistering machine gun fire. The battle for the northern forts became a saga of individual heroism and tactical disasters. Fort Stalin was taken only after a week of hand-to-hand fighting that saw the German 22nd Infantry Division suffer catastrophic losses. The Soviets fought for every room, every corridor, and every foxhole. One of the most tragic and heroic episodes occurred at the Maxim Gorky I battery. Even after the German engineers had managed to blast their way into the turret works, the Soviet gunners refused to surrender. They retreated deep into the lower levels of the complex, turning the ventilation shafts and service tunnels into a series of deadly ambushes. The Germans eventually had to use flamethrowers and poison gas to clear the tunnels, a grim testament to the fanatical resolve of the defenders. The fall of the northern sector was a victory for Manstein, but it was a victory bought with the lifeblood of his finest units. By late June, the situation for the Soviet garrison had become critical. The German Air Force, under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen, had established total air superiority, making it nearly impossible for the Black Sea Fleet to resupply the city. The last large transport ships to enter the harbor were sunk, and the defenders were forced to rely on submarines to bring in precious crates of ammunition and medical supplies. The soldiers were surviving on meager rations, drinking brackish water, and fighting with captured German weapons. Despite this, General Petrov and the Soviet leadership initially refused to evacuate. There was a belief, fueled by Stalin's orders, that the city could hold out indefinitely. This was the ultimate systemic failure of the Soviet side. By the time the command to evacuate was finally given in the final days of June, it was too late. The German forces had crossed the Severnaya Bay in a daring night amphibious assault, bypassing the strongest remaining defenses and threatening the city from the rear. The final act of the tragedy unfolded on the Kherson Peninsula, a narrow finger of land where tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers and civilians retreated, hoping for a rescue that would never come. The scene was one of apocalyptic horror. Soldiers stood on the beaches, staring out at the horizon, waiting for ships that had been diverted or destroyed. As the German tanks closed in, the Soviet officers were evacuated by the last remaining submarines, leaving behind the rank and file to face the vengeance of the conquerors. The fall of Sevastopol on July 4, 1942, was hailed in Berlin as a monumental triumph. Manstein was promoted to Field Marshal, and the 11th Army was celebrated as the victors of the Gibraltar of the East. But the irony was bitter. The siege had lasted 250 days, and the 11th Army was so depleted by the fighting that it was no longer capable of the rapid movement required for the upcoming summer offensive toward the Caucasus. The victory at Sevastopol was a hollow one. It had consumed the very resources Germany needed to win the war in the East. The ruins of the city stood as a silent witness to the futility of the struggle. Of the nearly 100,000 Soviet defenders left on the Crimean Peninsula, most were marched off into a brutal captivity from which few would return. The city itself was a graveyard of stone and steel, a place where the heroism of the individual had been swallowed by the cold machinery of total war. The unsung heroes, the nurses in the underground hospitals, the dock workers who loaded ships under a hail of bombs, and the sailors who held the line at the Sappan Heights, were largely forgotten in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe. Historically, the Siege of Sevastopol serves as a haunting reminder of the limits of military power. It proved that even the most advanced war machine could be bled white by a determined defender utilizing the landscape to their advantage. It was a precursor to the even greater horrors of Stalingrad, a laboratory for the urban attrition that would eventually consume the Third Reich. The philosophical takeaway is one of grim irony. The Germans won the battle for the fortress, but in doing so, they lost the momentum that might have won them the war. As we look back at the jagged cliffs and the quiet bays of the Crimea today, the echoes of the 800mm guns have long since faded, replaced by the gentle lapping of the Black Sea. But beneath the soil, the remnants of the concrete giants still remain, half buried in the earth like the bones of a prehistoric era. They stand as monuments to a time when the world held its breath, and a single city dared to defy the inevitable. The story of Sevastopol is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute annihilation, a story written in blood, limestone, and the cold salt spray of the sea. The sun sets today over Cape Cursones, casting long shadows across the ruins where the final stand was made. The ghosts of the Black Sea Fleet and the soldiers of the 11th Army are silent now, bound together in the eternal fraternity of the fallen. History remembers the names of the generals and the calibers of the guns, but the earth remembers the men who fought for a patch of rock as if it were the center of the universe. In the end, Sevastopol was not just a fortress, it was a mirror, reflecting the best and worst of what humanity is capable of when pushed to the very edge of existence. The siege is over, the guns are cold, and the city remains, a timeless sentinel watching over the dark, restless waters of the Black Sea.